Now let's look at the process of deploying a SharePoint app to Office 365. We're going to look at the different considerations you need to be thinking about when you're looking at deploying to O365, the different account setup processes that you need to look at, your licensing options, the validation policies, and availability. The first consideration you should be looking at with an O365 deployment is to identify your publication target. Are you looking at having this app available to your organization, and your organization just happens to have a SharePoint deployment in Office 365? This is a situation where many small businesses are in happen, or organizations, as they're no longer kind of provisioning their own data centers or moving into the cloud. This is going to be more and more of a common situation. But then you also have an option of actually publishing your SharePoint app into the Office Store itself. If you're not familiar with the Office Store, we've kind of shown you a little bit earlier in the process with Napa, but it's the ability to push out your functionality into a store just the same as you would with an application into the Windows Store for Windows 8 or for the Windows Phone Store for any of the Windows Phone programs. So being able to identify exactly which group you're looking at for your app is the first and most important thing you need to be aware of. Second is the security models. How are you actually going to push it out? What boundaries are in place? If you're looking at a situation where that you are going to be pushing that app into the Office Store, how are you making sure that you're identifying the proper licensing? How are you making sure that everything works correctly? How are you making sure that you're not exposing any data maybe on the back end to a customer that should not get access to it? Hosting. If you're doing a SharePoint app that's all client-side, that's basically running in the browser and pushing back into the SharePoint model, this isn't so much of a problem. You're actually just going to make sure that JavaScript code is available for the app itself. But remember that Office 365 apps may be written in various other languages that may need to run somewhere on a server. Being able to keep track of, are you going to be using an Azure SQL database to store your information for your app? Are you going to be using a Azure cloud service to actually run logic on that application on server side? Knowing how that's going to be, you're going to do that. And even more importantly, how you're going to scale that up, how you're going to make sure everything's in place. Be thinking about that. That's one of the pieces that a lot of people overlook, or they think that merely in terms of a simple implementation. With SharePoint and Office Store, you're going to be running into the same scaling concerns or scaling planning that you would putting out a public website, because basically that's what you're doing. You're making that web functionality available throughout the world and making sure that you've got that in place. Validation. This is going to be in two places, making sure that you're actually doing your testing and validating that the current version of your app meets all of your needs. You're pushing this out. It's going to be available outside your organization, making sure that you've got all of your security locked down. That model is correct, that you're able to make sure that the logic itself behaves in all the different areas. Again, if you're internal to your organization, this is going to be less of a concern. But if you're external, then you're going to make sure that you have organizations using your logic in very, very different ways than you thought about. So make sure that you're able to validate and prove out that your functionality is working correctly and appropriately for what's going on inside the model. And then tenancies. Are you going to be able to make sure that if this app goes out and multiple organizations are using it, it's split out between different organizations, different even departments inside your own organization, that those tenancies are in place? One of the worst things that you can have happen is have information bleed back and forth. A simple example of this is that if you've got pre-population drop-downs that are looking for information that users query on, for an example. If you're actually using something that's common between organizations, now you can actually find out information from different groups that bleeds over. Hey, someone's looking for John Smith. John Smith's not a part of our organization, who else is using this app, and how might we track him down? So there's a lot of things that you need to be looking at with those tendencies and being able to make sure that if you're deploying it into a SharePoint app, that all of that it's being firewalled off, and the users of particular implementations of this app have access only to the appropriate data. When you actually go through and do the account setup, know that publishing to the Office Store requires a setup similar to the Windows or Windows Phone Store. This shouldn't be surprising because the model is very, very similar. You're going to see all of these stores, to be honest, start converging as the similar accounts come into play. We've already seen that with the Windows and Windows Phone Store becoming a unified store model. Expect to see that happening with the SharePoint and Office stores as well. So the process is very, very similar. In the demo, we'll walk through it very quickly and show you some of the options there. The accounts themselves can be individual or company. So if you're an independent developer, you're in good shape. You can actually go in there. If you have an organization, you can actually put this up as one person doing the deploys and the store management there, and go into place. If you are doing that store management, have a dedicated account for it. If you're a ISV and you're part of BizSpark, having a dedicated account for that. If you're an organization that may have multiple dev teams or things like that, having that makes it very easy to do the publication, to have one person monitoring any store policy changes, all of those kind of pieces. If you've got multiples, then you're probably going to register them. You're going to spend a bit more money, and you're going to have a little bit less control over the presence that your company has in the store itself. For the license options, you can choose the model. With the SharePoint store, you can actually have the options that we have here. Perpetual all deployment user. Basically, this is for every deployment of Office 365, for every grouping. You can roll for all those users. This is kind of the traditional site licensing, except you don't really have a site, so it all kind of rolls in together. That can be free. That can be paid, or that can be the full site. So you can actually have multiple sites and work with how it works in that place. You could actually have a situation where you have some custom licensing options with that site licensing. The perpetual multi-user per user is paid. So basically you're offering up a per user license. The users themselves register in, and then they're paying off of those. Then you can have also the trial for deployment and trial for multi-user as well. So very, very, again, if you're working with Windows apps or that kind of thing, you're used to this. But if you haven't worked with this before, you got a lot of flexibility and a lot of optimization, a lot of options in there. For the validation policies, as you're going through, the SharePoint apps are submitted to Office Store, have to go through validation policies, similar to, again, what you're doing with Windows stores and phone stores. The app itself is inspected for malicious code, for that it's actually doing the functionality it promises, and for questionable content. And questionable content, just be business-like. The SharePoint apps are for business environments, and be aware that you're going to be basically standard business conduct. Validation is semi-automatic, but there are manual processes in there. Expect that it can take several days if volume is higher, or there needs to be some additional review on that. So don't expect that you're going to publish into the store and then everything show up right then. Availability, one of the biggest reasons is to ensure deployment availability. This is for SharePoint itself, making sure that SharePoint is up and running at all times. Your app availability will depend on every part of the deployment. Build for defense in depth. If you've got a situation where you may not be able to, you're running in a cloud instance that may be tying into multiple different types of data stores, put some defense in depth. Be able to gracefully recover if you can't get to maybe your table store or your SQL database, or even some of your content. Be able to go, hey, now we can't do this image. I've got some text pieces that handle from there. So just be smart and how you're deploying into the web itself. understand how this comes into play, and just make sure that you've got all of your nines that you can manage, knowing that the more pieces that you have, the more challenges you're going to have pushing that out. We will actually go through and walk through the process of registering and pushing up a SharePoint app into Office 365. Deploying an app to the SharePoint store is fairly simple. There are a lot of steps involved, but they tend to be fairly reasonable. What we're going to do here is walk through the first steps of doing a deployment into the SharePoint store. The first thing you need to do is go to sellerdashboard.microsoft.com. You'll need to have a valid Office 365 account. This would be most likely the account you used earlier with doing the Napa development. You're already registered in with the dev.office.com location, so that's a good one to kind of get started with. When you come into the page, you'll see something like you have on the screen here. You see that I have my account set up. You see me up in the upper right-hand corner. I actually had to get a validation code. If you haven't run into this with Microsoft accounts before, you will pretty quickly. Basically, it'll need to text you on a mobile phone. So be prepared to enter in your phone number, and it'll send you a validation code to make sure you're the right person. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You can actually see right here, I've got some account information that's needed. Go in and have the information here. This is my information, and we'll go, but what's requested is in the payout and tax. You'll see that I don't actually have the information in here. I haven't registered to deploy an application yet, but they will need that information before you go into the store. The reason for this is that if you are charging money, they kind of need to know where to send the information to and where to report it to. So you go in, enter in the information. Just a moment, and I'll leave this in here. Unfortunately for everyone, I'm not going to enter in all my tax information at this point, but we can go through and see. You can choose your regular bank account. You can actually go into PayPal, which is fairly easy and useful to do. Drop in, give it your information there. We'll drop over and do a PayPal, email address, confirmation, names, billing addresses, those kind of things. Generally all the stuff that you would normally expect to see. So pretty easy to do, not much of a big challenge to get that in there. I'm going to run back into the dashboard itself. When you're ready to do an account, it's going to make me drop in and do that as well. Let's go back one more time. And what you're going to want to do is go in and choose the apps that you're going to be looking at. So SharePoint, apps for SharePoint. Note with this same registration, you can do apps for Office, apps for Outlook. Both of these are on the Office 365 as well. And then a Windows Azure type. So agree to be bound by the terms. You can get the terms in there. We'll go through. And you see you've got the general app title, version, release date, and put it for a bit later. I'm going to put it for IT admin. Category communications. We're communicating to you how this can work. And again, communication. Drop your logo in and enter in your app package, which it will have you actually pull up your app package you've created through Visual Studio or downloaded from the developer site as we showed you in those demos. You can actually go in and tell that you need, as a service, requires server authentication, which can pass that information back and forth. And then you can pass in some information for the testers. Remember, once your app is submitted, it will go through a testing process. And if there's anything special they need to know about it, this is where you can drop it in there. App supports contains cryptography or encryption. Just to let them know, there are some additional rules around that, especially with international applications. Just be aware of that. And then you are required to give them some support documents, privacy document, and there's a video link if you want to. So you can actually give a quick little video about your application so people can do. You can also give the end user license agreement. Let's go to the save as draft. Have to have the logo and the rest. So we will go through there and you can actually see the details as you work through the process, the blocking access and the pricing, so you can actually put it in place. The block access is if you don't want to be in particular markets, if there's some concerns, that can be in there. So very simple to do, drop it up there. Once your app goes into the Office 365 location, then it will go through the review process and you'll either get back some feedback telling you why your app did not pass, or you'll be in the store and then you'll see it'll be published on your release date. I do have another link over here. This is actually off of the you can get this link from the Publish Apps for Office and SharePoint. And these are the links to go through for the validation process. Please go through these links very, very carefully. Just like putting an app in the Windows or phone store, there's a lot of different rules that you'll need to take a look at. Pretty much guarantee that if you don't go through the checklist and make sure you cover it all, you're probably not going to get into the store. So each one is there. And go ahead and make sure and review those pretty regularly, because they do change from time to time. They will be updated. You can actually see that we're now on 1.5. So you can actually go through and take a look and see, I've go through and check off each of the boxes. Submitted a specified icon, app ID is unique, has been tested and fully functional. All of these things, none of them are really that difficult, but you really do want to be able to go through and make sure you've got them before you actually push it off. Things such as app is not auto-hosted. As we went through the process of doing the development part of it, the samples there, you remember we talked about that you can auto-host on an internal SharePoint site. When you're doing a Office 365, there is no a local deployment that can auto-host it. The configuration is cloud configuration and does not allow you to do auto-hosting. So know that things like that are in there, that you've specified the locales if you're doing that, all of those kind of things. So again, nothing really complex, but an item to go through there. Again, just most of the deployment to Office 365 is going through the accounts, setting them up, making sure that you've got all the paperwork done, and then following the process. So it's a fairly straightforward process and should be fairly easy to do.